gathered here today because we all share rejection of the vile person that is Donald Trump. And let's be clear, Trump is a monster. Whether it's his racism, or his sexism, or his xenophobic rhetoric, or his bellicose blusterings about annihilating other countries, Trump has made it hard to deny that he is one of the worst among us. However, with a critical eye to the past, and the not-so-distant past at that, it must be said that Trump does not represent an anomaly in U.S. leadership. Going back to the so-called founding fathers of this country, we find that men like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, et al. Were some of the richest, most pompous people alive at that time. They were violent misogynists, slave-owning racists, and rapists who committed genocide against native peoples and Africans. They ruthlessly exploited the peasants and working class in this country to make themselves even richer, and they loathed democracy as, quote, the worst of all evils. Their crowning achievement, the Constitution, transmitted all of these evils onto paper and codified it into law. Oftentimes, we hear people talk about how Trump doesn't understand the Constitution, or that he's never read it, or that he doesn't care about it. I think instead, we ought to flip that criticism back on ourselves. Do we really know the Constitution? The Constitution is a document that justified through law the genocidal violence of colonialism and slavery despite its virtuous appeals to freedom and equality. It is a document that glorifies the pursuit of profit and essentially limits access to fundamental human rights to those who can afford them. Nowhere in the Constitution will you find the right to shelter, clean water, food, a job, healthcare, or education. Instead, we are offered righteous platitudes such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what are those things to a person who does not have the means to achieve any of them? A great man once said, "It is difficult for me to imagine what personal liberty is enjoyed by an unemployed person who goes hungry and cannot find employment. Real liberty can exist only where exploitation had been abolished, where there is no oppression of some by others, where there is no unemployment and poverty, where a man is not haunted by the fear of being tomorrow deprived of work, of home, and of bread. Only in such a society is real and not paper, personal, and every other liberty possible." I say this Constitution is not something that should be held up and regarded as some kind of sacred text, but something that needs to be discarded as a marker of a bygone era and a system whose time has long since ended. More recent leaders, relatively speaking, like Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, JFK, Lyndon Johnson, Jimmy Carter, Clinton, and Obama, the so-called good presidents, the liberals and progressives, wholly accepted the mantle passed down to them from these despicable humans we call the founding fathers. They took what their forebears had done to indigenous peoples in the U.S. and applied those policies abroad. What's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine too, or else, was and remains U.S. foreign policy, and this is not a break from some hallowed tradition, but rather a continuation of systemic exploitation, rape, murder, and pillaging. We remember Teddy Roosevelt as some kind of staunch defender of America and its progressive tradition because he founded some national parks or something. Teddy Roosevelt was a racist warmonger who believed in eugenics, the killing of the weak links in society for the betterment of all. You know, like the Nazis. The national parks he founded represented huge land grabs from the indigenous people, an example of their continued genocide. He was also in the pocket of big business and made no scruples about letting people know about his disdain for the poor. We remember FDR as some kind of humanist icon, a great symbol of hope in one of America's darkest hours. What we don't remember is that he essentially provoked Japan through sanction and embargo into an attack against Pearl Harbor, which gave him a reason to enter into World War II so that the U.S. could pull itself out of the Great Depression through a program like what was to become the Marshall Plan. We don't talk about how he was surrounded by big business advisors who made sure the social programs he was implementing weren't going too far. We don't talk about how it was FDR who ordered the forced internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans, or how all of those people had their property and wealth stolen from them and never returned after they were released from the concentration camps. Harry S. Truman saw us to victory in World War II, but is perhaps the greatest war criminal in the history of the world for waging an endless firebombing campaign on the people of Japan intended to induce terror and mass suffering, and then needlessly dropping the only 2 atomic bombs ever used by any government on people anywhere. Eisenhower spoke a big game about the military-industrial complex, but instigated a genocidal war against the people of Korea that saw the extermination of 5 million people, or more, the estimates vary, through the carpet bombing of the peninsula, including guided strikes against civilian targets like farms, water treatment facilities, and the like. All things which qualify as war crimes according to the U.S. laid out by the Geneva Convention. During the Eisenhower administration, we also saw an uptick in U.S. covert actions in Central America, particularly in Guatemala, where we were responsible for the ouster of the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz in favor of a fascist regime, all because the U.S. business United Fruit Company did not agree with Arbenz's program of land reform. JFK and Lyndon B. Johnson can be jointly held responsible for nearly bringing the world to an end through nuclear war when they provoked the Soviets by installing nuclear missiles along their border in Turkey, much like the U.S. under Obama and now Trump is doing today in Poland along the modern-day border with Russia, which then prompted what has come to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. We saw regime change operations in Central and South America as well as in Africa during this time, sponsored by the U.S. LBJ was an old-time Dixiecrat from the South. Translation, he was a racist and absolutely said disparaging things about black Americans behind closed doors. He got us involved in yet another genocidal war in Vietnam that saw the ultra-violent rape and slaughter of some million or more Vietnamese. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, all involved in the war in some fashion or another, are still dealing with the effects of this war today. Vietnam has some of the highest rates of cancer in the world, and children are frequently born with a litany of birth defects as a result of the mass dumping of Agent Orange produced by American companies DuPont and Monsanto. All 3 countries have landmines littered across their land that people still die from today. We think of Carter's presidency as a quiet one, mostly forgettable, and can look to him now as a sweet old man who occasionally makes some nice comments that sound good in the press. However, it was under Carter that we saw the beginnings of the crisis in the Middle East when the U.S. began funding and training the Taliban in Afghanistan to fight against and topple the government there for allowing women to have access to education and a better life. He also initiated the sanctions regime against Iran after they had a revolution in 1979 to oust the U.S.-backed government of the Shah. Sanctions which continue to hurt the people of Iran to this day. Carter continued the U.S. legacy of the Monroe Doctrine intervention in Central and South America as well. Clinton's crimes are more recent in the memory of some of us, as is his gross male chauvinism. Responsible for damning welfare reform, a surge of tough-on-crime legislation that targeted people of color at a far higher rate than any other group, the implementation of the Defense of Marriage Act, and the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policies in the military, and the further monopolization of media conglomerates. We saw increasing wealth disparities between the owning class and the working class as a result of Clinton's neoliberal economic policies. The signing of NAFTA, the creation of the WTO, the GATS, and other deals signaled an attack against oppressed peoples and the working class everywhere, but particularly in Mexico and other so-called underdeveloped countries. This was yet another victory for the ruling class as their transnational corporations continued to gain enough power beyond the reach of governments and the people they claim to serve. This is all without mentioning the attacks against Yugoslavia, Somalia, Haiti, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Sudan, among others. The continued sanctions against Iraq from the first Gulf War under Bush I was ultimately responsible for the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children. Obama did great things regarding marriage equality in the country, oversaw the extension of health care to millions of Americans, including an elimination of the pre-existing conditions clause that allowed insurers to deny coverage to certain people who likely needed it most, and has the historical designation of being the country's first black president. However, the wealth gap under Obama widened and deepened more so than it has in the history of this country. Despite the expansion of coverage, the ACA was a conservative bill designed by Mitt Romney that was a giveaway to insurance companies, did only marginal good in terms of addressing the ever-increasing cost of health care. I'm almost done. and made it mandatory for people who may not be able to afford insurance premiums to have it anyway or pay a fine. The civil liberties of U.S. citizens continued to suffer as the expansion of the NSA continued from Bush's presidency into Obama's. Obama was responsible for the bailout of the corrupt bankers who manipulated working-class people into irresponsible loans that prompted an inevitable economic collapse, and made sure that virtually none of those bankers saw any punishment, unlike in other countries where their bankers were often jailed or worse. Obama was responsible for record-breaking arms deals to reactionary regimes in countries like Saudi Arabia, and for the indiscriminate bombing campaigns in 7 or more countries. We saw the first drone assassinations of a U.S. citizen and his children, 16 and 7 years old, ordered directly by the president, and the introduction of an unthinkable kill list, which included the names of people that the president wanted dead. We saw a ramping up of sanctions on the north of Korea, and a revitalization and modernization of our massive stock of nuclear weapons, despite the president winning a Nobel Peace Prize for a speech he gave where he said some nice things about nuclear disarmament. Trump may be a disgusting, repugnant human being, but he is not the cause of the problems that continue to ail the oppressed peoples and working class in this country and around the world. These problems can be traced back all the way to the beginning of this country, when it was founded on top of genocide, slavery, patriarchy, and class oppression. Every leader, president or congressperson, has participated in the maintenance, expansion, and evolution of the system specifically designed to keep the owning class on top at the expense of the working class. No, Trump is not the disease in our society as some would like to paint him. Rather, he is a symptom of a system on its last legs, a system being propped up by a 230-year-old document and social institutions designed to serve as life support, a system in its death throes. Trump is not unique. He is simply the ruling class with its mask ripped off. Trump is late-stage capitalism in all its moribund, decrepit glory. This system under which we live and suffer rests on a crumbling foundation. It's waiting for us to come along and topple it once and for all. We can only do that if we stand together, united and organized. The people, united, will never be defeated.
Right.